Hello, this is Robert Cruz. I am the Managing Director of the Information Governance Practice from Smarsh, and I am here today to talk about information governance. And so thank you very much for spending a little time with us. We will cover some of the topics that involve the use of social media, mobile communications, and cloud, and what those do to the process of information governance. So over the next 45 minutes or so, what we plan to cover, just a brief introduction, and then some of the challenges that we see organizations faced with today, changes that are brought about by differences and evolution in the way that they're communicating, both internally as well as with clients. And we're going to talk about the implications that creates for information governance, how organizations need to be managing information value and risk. So we'll talk about the unique complications that are created by today's communication channels, the rich dynamic nature of tools like Microsoft Teams, like Cisco WebEx Teams, like Symphony and Slack, like mobile communications. What are some of the unique things that organizations are faced with from an information governance standpoint? We'll then speak a little bit about cloud, about the fact that, for many of these applications, a lot of the data is residing in the cloud. How does that create additional considerations for companies thinking about information governance? And then we'll finish it up with some best practices. What do we see organizations doing in order to stay ahead of some of these new challenges that are brought about by the new ways of communicating with your clients and with your folks internally? So by way of fast introduction, first of all, my name is Robert Cruz. As I mentioned, I am the head of our information governance practice. And so what we do is essentially work with our clients in the areas of e-discovery, regulatory compliance, as well as governance, kind of thinking about how they can best use the technology that we're providing to them. How can they manage that risk and value according to the different communication sources that are being used? The organization I work with, Smarsh and Actiance, is actually a merger of two organizations. We recently have come together to form a singular entity. And basically the significance of that is that to bringing kind of two areas of strength together as one company. On the Smarsh side, an organization that has very strong acceptance in the market, a market leader according to Gartner, recognized strengths in the information archiving space, strengths both across financial services as well as public sector. And on the Actiance side, focus around helping organizations to deal with compliance. So doing that in technologies to capture different communication sources, and more recently, an introduction into the information archiving space. So on the Actiance side, a focus on some of the larger organizations, some of the organizations that have to deal with multinational complexity, dealing with different privacy laws and different regulatory obligations they have to deal with around the world. Across the two companies, we now see very strong combination of assets, both in terms of the breadth and depth of our capabilities, the variety of communication sources that we can control, as well as the volume of information that we're managing, over 80 different communication networks that we're helping firms to bring within their information governance structures. And the validation that we've seen in the form of strategic partnerships, the IBM, Microsoft, AT&T, Cisco, and others, we believe is a strong testament to the quality of the products that we're doing and the fact that the technology is helping to address some complex challenges, in particular extending some of the native capabilities of the different communication tools that companies are using more and more today. So let's kind of jump into the discussion and talk first about today's communication challenges. And, when we talk about communication and how does this pertain to governance, we see a lot of focus in information governance around structured data, about what companies are doing with applications, things they may have been doing historically and traditionally with records management applications or perhaps ECM. Well, the reality that we're seeing today is that we see organizations that have essentially gone through a fairly significant transformation, the way that they interact and address their clients. What had been done via email and mobile communication and voice. What you're seeing over the past 2 years or so is that organizations have seen a dramatic expansion of the different communication networks that they're allowing their individuals to use as part of their jobs. And so you see here, larger firms have upwards of 20 to 30 different communication networks that they're letting individuals use. they're using Microsoft Teams as part of an Office 365 rollout, or they've deployed Cisco WebEx Teams, or they're using Box as a storage location. They're allowing their organizations to use social media as part of their jobs to reach out to their clients. The reason is simple. It's these tools are working. These are where your clients are. These are the channels that they demand that you support. So we see more organizations providing a broader level of access to these different communication tools. And this is happening across regulated and non-regulated organizations. So it's been a fairly broad rate of adoption. And it's not just about communication. It's also about collaboration. How are people exchanging files? How are they sharing work product? And again, this is not all happening now in a confined, controlled environment. It's happening in the wild, in unstructured content locations. And as I said, a lot of this happening either in the cloud or on mobile devices. So it raises a number of complications and challenges. Let's talk to some of those items that are most problematic. When you look at governance, you look at what traditionally has been defined as a file or as a document or as a piece of structured information. The challenge today is that you see through a lot of these communication tools now the ability to interact through multiple modalities, if you will. The idea that you can share, video and voice. You can use characters to communicate. You can conduct transactions through some of these applications. So clearly there's things that are happening on these networks that have business value. A very good example is what we see on the unified communications front, both with Microsoft Teams as well as WebEx Teams, Symphony, and other collaborative platforms. Again, very rich and very dynamic. The idea that you're not just sending messages, you're interacting, you're carrying out a conversation. And in those conversations, things might change. They might be altered or deleted. This creates a series of implications for how you address your records management programs, your regulatory obligations, how you enable readiness for e-discovery. And it's even to the point now where we see regulated firms are finding conversations that are taking place entirely in emoji characters, essentially encoded conversations that individuals with intent on doing harm are using characters to express or to cover tracks around specific events and activities. So how do you decode all of this? How can you ensure that you are treating these communications properly according to their importance? As far as who's paying attention to these things? Well, clearly the regulators as well as the courts. The regulators have been clear, and you can look across financial services, healthcare, energy, pharma, and they've all said something very consistent, which is it's the content and the context of the communication that is determinative. It is not the channel of communications that an individual happens to be using. So if it's sensitive information, it's sensitive information, whether it's being delivered over email or via a chat or through a social media conversation. On the litigation side, clearly a very quickly growing body of court decisions and rulings that have basically called out what firms are doing around social media and text messaging. On the social media side, what you find is that a lot of the cases have made it clear, as if there was any doubt, that there are specific instances where these social communications are relevant and material to a litigation. And they've asked clients, they've asked participants in court to basically ensure that what's being captured is being done the proper way, that it's being done proportionate to the value and the importance for discovery. But clearly cases that are arising that involve the use of social and collaborative communications. Similar dynamics on the mobile side, where you have a variety of cases where there has been a court decision indicating that an individual has an obligation to produce information that might have been expressed in a text message. Or if they were using a mobile application, they ended up in a bad spot because the individual deleted that mobile application. So, as it pertains to the growth in both the courts as well as outlined within specific regulations, clearly there's a lot of focus and attention to what firms are doing in these areas. So why is it different? I mean, what is different about a communication that happens over, a series of text messages versus what people are accustomed to dealing with over email? Let's talk about some of the unique elements of what these new tools can provide. One important consideration, I think, if you look at any information governance program or any program that attempts to manage the risk of the various structured and unstructured pieces of information, one of the dynamics you find is that today, a lot of those systems, a lot of those processes, a lot of what people have been trained to do is to focus on the communication networks or the applications that are most common, that are in greatest use. And so you see, for example, in financial services industry, a lot of the communications, compliance and supervision processes and technologies to support that were designed for email. They were designed 10 or 15 years ago to understand a subject, body, and a header of a message. And the challenge is that as you spend more of your time and effort focused on those email communications, you have less time to understand the things that may be happening as part of a conversation on a collaborative platform. Again, individuals that may be coming and joining a conversation, individuals that may have inadvertently disclosed intellectual property, or someone who potentially is sending out information that may be leaking that's outside of the perimeter of your existing data loss prevention technology. So the things to consider here as you look at how can you shift the energy is that, point number one is very important, is that individuals that may have intent on wrongdoing will go where they think you aren't. They're going to be looking for the opportunities to find, here's the cracks in the compliance protocol. Here's the areas where we can exchange information, where you can potentially move a communication across channels. So that's something that we see in the broker-dealer space where FINRA, as well as the SEC on the third bullet, have actually said you need to pay attention to these high-risk activities and high-risk individuals with something they call heightened supervision. You need to look at where these greater areas of risk resides, and you need to define specific policies to be able to track and understand what is happening on those other networks. And also, just to circle back on the second point, you also have to think about the tools you're using today for supervisory review, for e-discovery, for information archiving and governance. Are these tools really capable of addressing the richness, the dynamic nature, the modalities that individuals have access to through some of these more advanced technologies in use today? So let me click into the challenges and the differences here. So when you have a conversation that's happening on LinkedIn or what individuals may be doing on Slack, you have to be asking the questions of how would you be able to capture and preserve that content if you were required to do so, either for regulatory purposes or because it falls into the criteria within your information governance program. Every communication network, and those on the chart and beyond, have a slightly different way to access their communication streams. Some provide APIs, some don't. Some have access which is not quite good enough for some firms that have regulatory compliance demands. So you have to look at, if you were required to do so, is there a mechanism that will allow you to go in and grab the information you need to preserve to address one of those regulatory or litigation use cases. Secondly, individuals are now on multiple networks. And so if you've been through a data mapping exercise and just trying to understand who are the individuals and what are the content sources that they are associated with, that can become a pretty complicated process. And in particular, if you look at 20 to 30 different communication networks per individual, you're looking at a combination of screen names, buddy names, things that don't map easily to your Active Directory infrastructure. So you have to think about what's the method that I'm going to use in order to understand all the different tools that are at that individual's disposal. And so, a starting point here is in your communications guidelines, you have permitted use of particular networks. Once you have permitted use of those networks, you need to start thinking about building the data map so you understand how individuals are identified, and what would be the method that you would be utilizing if you had to for discovery. The third bullet is very important in that, again, back to the original premise that content and context are determinative. I, as a compliance officer or somebody who is managing our record schedules, if a Social Security card number appears, or if a term that is covered under our non-disclosure agreement with a partner appears in a communication, I need to have a mechanism to enforce my policies through those specific networks. So what is the reach and ability for you to potentially restrict the use of some of those applications, to ensure that you can spot the high-risk information that might be traveling on a unified communications platform? What mechanisms are available to me to create uniform policy enforcement across the variety of networks that are out there? Monitoring specific features. Again, there may be, let's take Office 365 as a very good example. You know, you have technologies under the umbrella, including Microsoft Teams and Skype for Business and Yammer and OneDrive and SharePoint. There may be features and functions within those tools that you are just not comfortable providing access to. How can you do that? Is that something that are there ways to automate disabling of specific features so that, let's say, your client-facing representatives may not be given access to a video or a screen sharing piece of functionality? You know, important considerations to know if these are things that are possible for you to control and manage. And finally, we see a lot of organizations that not only review communications after the fact, but they want to be able to spot infractions before they hit their e-discovery process or regulatory compliance activities. So, you know, are there ways to pre-review or to inspect some of these communications in stream so that you can moderate and potentially block some messages from being delivered in the first place? So a variety of things to think through. And as I said, each of these communication networks is going to behave slightly differently. So a very good exercise to understand what the native capabilities of all these tools are and where there are third parties that are available in the marketplace for you to be able to augment some of those controls. So let's talk about the cloud. And so we have the premise that there's this variety of communication sources. These are communication tools which you have allowed your employees to use as part of their jobs. You know, we're talking about the business use primarily. There's clearly a line that in many cases, because of evolving data privacy law, becomes harder to draw between business and personal use. But when you look just at the business side of the equation, there are clearly areas where there's interaction and collaboration happening where firms need to be thinking about extending their controls. Let's go further. Let's talk about the cloud, because the cloud raises another set of questions. And the reality is, for the majority of the networks that I just talked about, most of those networks store their information within a cloud infrastructure. So as you think about information governance, how can you add the discussion of cloud into the analysis? I think a good place to start in the discussion here is the recognition that cloud services are not homogenous. There isn't, you know, a singular good answer or wrong answer. It's a spectrum. And clearly there are technology providers, cloud service providers that are better than others in terms of allowing you to be able to govern the way that those communication sources are accessible, the way that they are managing data privacy, and the way that they allow you to extract that information if you need it. So, you know, a couple of key considerations here in terms of, you know, are they enabling you to adhere to specific locality and jurisdictional requirements? If you have business communications that are happening in a market that has very strict data privacy or data locality mandates, do they offer a mechanism where you might be able to store some of that data locally? I mean, clearly we see on the business to consumer side, you know, any social media platform that has an ad-driven business model, these things are not very easy. These, you know, companies in that part of the spectrum are not well suited to be able to address some of these locality concerns. Business applications, it varies. Secondly, data protection. This sounds like a very simple question to ask, but data protection you can kind of break into a couple of buckets. You can break it into the data privacy controls as well as what these cloud service providers are doing in the area of data security. Why is the data security important from an information governance perspective? Because it's about information risk. And if the cloud service provider is not providing both the technology, the skills, the defined processes to address information security threats, then it really compromises the effectiveness of your program, obviously. So understanding what these firms have put in place, the protocols that they actively manage to deal with things like the detection and response to data breaches, to provide the appropriate level of encryption so that information is not exposed in the clear and is not accessible to third parties, to provide the appropriate level of protections if in particular your content is being stored in a multi-tenant cloud environment where essentially you're sharing infrastructure with other clients. Can they prevent or minimize the risk of inadvertent access by another customer using that same cloud infrastructure? If you look at the privacy side, clearly there's a lot of things happening here because of GDPR. You now have a data privacy regulation that's been implemented in the state of California. You will have more in the U.S. because ultimately you're seeing individuals expressing a greater interest and demand to ensure that they know what's being done with their information. So quite simple, but it creates accountability to the cloud service provider so that they can provide the assurance that information is being used only for the purpose that it was captured for. So, if in fact an individual does request that information, how can it be retrieved? This is one of the things that many cloud service providers do a good job of being somewhat opaque as far as their provisions to extract information. How easy is it for me to get my data back? One of the worst situations to be in is wanting to extricate yourself from an agreement with the cloud service provider or wanting to export large volumes of content. And the answer is, well, here's the fee from our professional services, or here's the number of years that might be required for you to extract your information. So knowing how you get your data out is an important consideration for any good governance initiative, just to ensure that you have the flexibility to work with that individual cloud provider and potentially move your information if your service provider is not living up to your governance objectives. Now, expectations. As any organization has learned, from the past year of GDPR, even if you don't have operations within Europe, it's causing firms to think about the way that they prioritize data privacy, and that interrogation, that kind of exercise in going through and testing the various controls that you have in place, you should extend to your service providers, including those service providers that manage data in the cloud. And I think there's some very basic things when you look at all of these new communication and collaboration tools, questions that you should be asking. Number one, is there certainty about where your data is being stored? And again, there's no one answer that it's done a specific way. Practices vary dramatically. And so it's an area where I think more clients are becoming more demanding and rigorous in terms of understanding a cloud storage infrastructure, how they add and balance capacity, what happens as their data grows or as they add a new remote operation. What does that mean in terms of the way that the information is going to be stored by the service provider? Regional and local policy enforcement, the ability to implement controls, regardless of whether there's actual physical presence in that market, as we understand from GDPR, if you need to ensure that EU citizens' data is being protected, those are controls that people need to have an understanding of and have the ability to execute within their cloud service infrastructure. So knowledge of those unique local requirements and the ability to execute upon them is something that, again, practices and levels of expertise and capability vary. Data limits and data access. So having good access controls, again, another fairly fundamental concept, but the notion of ensuring that there are audited controls in place that outline, who are the defined groups of individuals that have access to the data, and what are the implications if someone who is not or who is not authorized to access that information, what happens? What are the SLAs as far as restricting rights of use and access of that data by specific individuals? I've talked about data security, but I think the security protocols, as well as understanding of data privacy, it's not just about encryption, and it's not just about, pseudo-anonymization of data. It's the technology, it's the expertise, it's the defined protocols. And, one particular measure that we found effective is SSAE 16, the successor to what was it? The acronym escapes me, but it's essentially the security and operational and management controls that outline what a firm does. It's audited and attested to by a third party. And so it'll give you a very clear articulation of what the controls the firm has in place and they have in active management. And ultimately, maybe hosting data in Europe is an option. So having the ability to actually work with a partner to host data in a specific jurisdiction may be something that you might think about from a cloud service provider as a way to ensure that you've got the local knowledge you need. So dynamic conversations, many of them in the cloud. How does this affect the way that you run your information governance programs? Let's talk about some best practices. When you think about communication on a mobile device, or you think about using Twitter or Facebook or Microsoft Teams, any of these communication tools, in spite of their dynamic, multimodal nature, the way to control them really, again, it all starts and ends with governance. It all comes back to, number one, are you on top of what communication channels individuals inside your company are using? Do you have the approved list of channels and then the other list, which are the other communications that may be operating in the shadow IT world? So having a complete list of the approved networks and the other networks which you need to consider, you need to look at and inspect to determine if there is an authorized use and how you might be able to regain control of that. From a policy perspective, the simple idea of just attempting and striving to apply policies uniformly across each network. Not all networks allow you to exert the same level of control as what you've been accustomed to for files or records or email. But striving to continue to add more capabilities through those networks, it's things where Microsoft is listening and Cisco is listening. They recognize that if they're looking to achieve enterprise adoption of their communication networks, they're going to provide more robust access to the APIs and the controls that will allow firms to do that. I think a good governance concept is, the idea that records live in a central location. It was a nice story, and at the ARMA conference coming up in a few weeks, that will still be, a part of the discussion. But the recognition today has to be that information value and risk live everywhere. However individuals are communicating, however they're sharing work product, however they're potentially delivering a response to a client. The tools are too numerous, and the results and the productivity gains are too great. It's not something that's going to be reversed. Individuals continue to go places where they can get more done. And so the presumption that value and risk is going to live in those networks has to be paramount. And finally, when you look at what is the role of the IT organization, as well as the risk management office or the governance team, it's really a need to stay in line and in lockstep with the users, and what are understanding what are the tools they're using, what are the things their clients are asking them to do. If your clients are pushing you to support WhatsApp and WeChat, then you need to understand what are the reasons and the motivations for that. so that you can begin to plan and look at alternatives. So understanding what's driving the new forms of communication is one of the things that we find is absolutely necessary to drive from a cross-functional perspective. Specifically, when it comes to a new communication tool, and we talk to customers all the time that this is it's more than a weekly occurrence where the committee meets and there's a new tool that a particular business unit or function or department is asking for access to. And so, similar to the last slide, I think the ideas of, if I need to capture and control this communication source, how would I do that? What methods are available? Is there an API? Are there third-party technologies that allow me to do that? Is there a way for us to at least document what the process would look like? Maybe the access is not as complete as it could be, but what would we do in order to identify, collect, preserve, and review that communication source? Clearly, if it's an application that disappears, that's a bigger challenge. So again, before enabling the use, it's understanding the implications and what happens if one is faced with regulatory or e-discovery. I talked about the cross-functional alignment, but here very imperative that these decisions about support of new tools, not just be business users, ringing the IT front door and looking for support. It's involving the other stakeholders that need to assess the risk. The benefits you're hearing from the business users. What is the risk that the compliance and legal, as well as the security stakeholders, have assessed in that particular network? There are alternatives. And that's one of the good things with a new communication tool being born almost every day, is that there are alternatives that will allow people to accomplish a lot of the same goals, but not have as great an exposure. There are some tools that are providing better coverage for you, better level of access than others. And the last point, adjusting training and policies. We see that as a very common first step. Our last couple of years of work with the Information Governance Initiative with Barclay Blair, the projects that firms are engaging in to address all of these new complex networks is to adjust the communication policies. What are the permitted and acceptable uses? What are the things that are absolutely off the table? So making sure those policies are articulated and updated and providing the training so that end users understand what their obligations are. That last part, I just want to quickly touch it because I think, it's the notion of expecting end users to be records managers was disproven many years ago, and I think you're finding the same scenario here. Individuals are going to need some very specific guidance in terms of what are the capabilities that they're allowed to take advantage of through these new networks, and what are the prohibited use cases. So making this as explicit as possible through each of these communication networks, because each is going to have a different set of capabilities. So what are you allowed to do on Slack versus Microsoft Teams? Understanding what is necessary for that individual to do their job with that specific feature. And ultimately involving the user in the process of writing new policies so that you know the things that are not going to get in their way of being productive, of building a better relationship with their client, but at the same time, things that are going to allow you to manage the risk. From a technology perspective, is this an answer? The answer is yes and no. There's no silver bullet in terms of being able to extend governance across such a heterogeneous group of communication tools and collaborative platforms. But there is opportunity to remove manual keystrokes, in particular as it pertains to the capture and retaining of this data. Being able to automate the capture, to find a mechanism where you can enable access to grab information from the source, to use the API. You can reduce the manual steps and the handoffs that are required to ensure that you have this information under control. The notion of automatic capture and filtering, essentially auto classification, holds a significant amount of promise, because what that in essence is enabling is at the front door having some assignment made of a piece of information so that you can say, here's what the risk level or the value is for that particular communication. It's what firms are trying to do with email and other files and documents and other structured information. the same logic, the same technology power can enable more intelligent classification to take the user out of that decision of saying this is a business record or this pertains to a client contract. There are technologies that are evolving and show a lot of promise as far as being able to have a classification assigned to an item so that it is more appropriately managed inside of your systems. And last point of accounting for the shadow IT, it's inevitable that we talk to firms that say, they feel like they have a good understanding of the tools that people are using, and inevitably there's another tool that the business users say that is in use in Asia or India or some other part of the department that they may not have exposure to. So accounting for those items that are still in the shadows that need to be brought under the tent, is an area where technologies can help in just exposing where there might be unauthorized use of these of various communication networks across the organization. So let me sum it up. As we talk about information governance and the challenge that is brought upon by today's communication and collaboration tools, I think the first thing to take away from this discussion is that it's inevitable and it's irreversible. The ways that organizations are communicating and doing business has fundamentally been altered. And the days of email and files and documents being the predominant set of tools to manage governance initiatives, are numbered. So getting in front of these communication shifts across different parts of the organization is a prerequisite. That's the step one. Becoming an active participant, for those that are involved in governance initiatives, being in the mix, in the discussion with the stakeholders as new communication tools are evaluated. Again, the ability to articulate what is the risk vector on that particular item needs to be part of the calculus against the value it's delivering to the business. And it's best, described and represented by those that have, a governance perspective on assessment of risk. Looking at policy enforcement across all channels, that's a nirvana. It's not possible today. It's going to continue to be an evolutionary pursuit in terms of having controls that you can implement uniformly in the cloud. Each network will be slightly different, but continuing to push to have the ability to provide better control, more proactive ways to monitor and measure what is being used on these networks is a journey that firms should be on. And finally, is to have a plan. It's, even if the answer is not to proactively capture everything, not to have everything under management from day zero, at minimum, it's having a program, having a playbook defined so that it's clear. If we have to capture information from Microsoft Teams or from Spark or from IceChat or FactSet or Thomson Reuters, here's the way it's going to be done. Here's who's going to do it. Here's who owns the communication source. Here's how the information is going to be reviewed. It's good to have that plan before the event occurs because doing it in real time is a significant challenge. So with that, that's a fly-through of some of the things that we've been hearing and discussing with clients as they begin to rethink the way that they're storing and ensuring that risks are being managed across these different communication platforms. We do quite a bit of writing, webinars and other posts that you can find at smarsh.com. Would encourage you to take a look at that for more information and also reach out to us. Happy to come and talk to you one-on-one about some of the things that we're up to and some of the best practices that we're seeing emerge across the industry. So with that, I appreciate you spending the time with us. Let me see if there was a question that came in here. And I think we're good. I think we covered most of those points. So with that, thank you very much for your time and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.